Today I am sitting with Chris Sciabarra, who is an Italian-American living in Brooklyn. We're in his apartment. How are you, Chris?
Well, I'll actually expand on that. I'd make a joke out of this, I'm actually half Greek and half Sicilian. I often joke that my maternal grandparents were born in Olympia, Greece, home of the gods and goddesses, and my paternal grandparents were born in Porto Empedicle, Sicily, home of the godfathers. So I'm all Brooklyn.
You're all Brooklyn.
Yeah.
And you were born and raised in Brooklyn.
In Brooklyn, yes.
What do you do here?
Oh, goodness. Well, I'm primarily an author and an editor. I've been writing for as long as I could remember. My first professionally published articles were done when I was in college, but I had a trilogy of books that came out between 1995 and 2000. I call it the Dialectics and Liberty Trilogy. First one was Marx, Hayek, and Utopia, SUNY Press, 1995. Second was Ayn Rand, The Russian Radical, in 1995. And the final book in the trilogy was Total Freedom Toward a Dialectical Libertarianism. And a few other books were co-edited during that period. As feminist interpretations of Ayn Rand, for example, and as late as 2019, I did The Dialectics of Liberty, also co-edited.
Chris's sense of freedom began not in the body, but in the mind. Living with the rare condition Superior Mesenteric Artery Syndrome, he faced lifelong physical challenges that made everyday life a constant negotiation. What emerges is a deep, powerful contrast and ultimately a reconciliation between independence as an idea and interdependence as a reality. Raised in a close-knit Brooklyn family, Chris's story reveals how freedom is often sustained not alone, but through deep bonds of care and mutual support. This is a conversation about philosophy, illness, and the quiet strength of family, the kind that makes survival and even flourishing possible. I'm Leah Hirschfeld, and this is episode 13 of Out of Sync, exploring life through disability, one story at a time. New episodes drop every Tuesday on all platforms. Transcripts are on YouTube. You can support this show by clicking on the support link in the episode description. And now grab a cup of your favorite drink and enjoy the story. You've said the name Ayn Rand quite a few times.
Yes.
Who is she and who is she for you?
Well, she was a Russian-American author and philosopher, and I was introduced to her actually in high school. It was funny because always very political. I mean, from a very young age. And in high school, I had been in an advanced placement social studies course on American history. And we were talking about all sorts of things. I had more of a kind of conservative politics back then. I was never very comfortable with the conservative social politics, but at least in terms of economics, free markets, and what have you. And my sister-in-law, ironically, was listening to me argue about all sorts of points. She says, I'm reading this book called Atlas Shrugged. She said, it sounds so much of like what you're talking about. And so I said, well, let me see it. And she brought out this book that was, yay big, very, very large. And I said, I can't possibly read that book. Are you kidding me? It's over 1,000 pages. I'm in the midst of, schoolwork. So I looked at the back and I saw there was another book called Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. I said, all right, I'll read that. And it really was a revelation to me insofar as it opened up a whole world of free market, classical liberal, and libertarian thinking. And I drove my teachers crazy because I was bringing up all sorts of points that were not in the typical curriculum. And I ended up reading all of her nonfiction before I even touched any of her fiction. And so she made a big impact on me in terms of the politics. And the philosophy in general, her protege was Nathaniel Branden, and I had the fortune many years later of meeting him. His work on self-esteem and the psychology of self-esteem made a huge impact on me as well.
What are the principles that they defended?
Well, I think that she always believed that the core principle was, reason being the most important attribute of human beings in being able to survive in this world. But I think what's even more important is the fact that, in general, what they're projecting is an integrated view of of human being. You know, the integration of mind and body, the integration of reason and emotion, trying to lead a life under conditions of freedom and personal flourishing. It's a very individualist message, and it's one that certainly resonated with me. In many ways, it tied, strangely so, because this is a woman who believed in, you know, private charity rather than, let's say, government help. But yet, what she had to say about thinking for yourself and that kind of inner strength was very important to me in terms of my disabilities. Because when you're faced with so many challenges in this world, that kind of a message is something where you need to really focus on what is important, what's positive. It's very easy to fall into wallowing in one's miseries. And I think that the uplifting message that came out of the works of Rand and others who were influenced by her definitely made that kind of an impact on me. You know.
What are your disabilities?
Well, that's a long story. So if you don't mind sitting back and hearing about this.
I want to.
Sure. I was born with, we actually didn't find out what my disabilities were until I was about 13 and almost dead, almost being blunt. The actual condition is called Superior Mesenteric Artery Syndrome, or SMAS for short. Now, at the time that they had diagnosed me with this, it really is something that was it continues to be a very rare disease or condition. What happens is that the superior mesenteric artery forms a kind of almost a rubber band around the third and fourth portions of the duodenum. And so most of my childhood, I always was suffering from various bouts of nausea, some vomiting, sometimes diarrhea, not knowing what was really wrong. It was never just a sickly childhood. And it wasn't until about age 11, when I hit adolescence, that the condition became really severe. I mean, I dropped enormous weight, and that usually they kind of go together, because as you're dropping the weight, what's essentially happening is it's obstructing food. It's forming these rubber bands. By the time the food gets down to the third and fourth portions of the duodenum, it's almost getting as large as the stomach until the pressure is so big that it pushes through. And when it pushes through, you have almost like a dumping syndrome. In other situations where the artery collapses, you're vomiting food up. So essentially you're in a life-threatening situation. But I must have gone for, I don't know, there must have been over 100 tests of every kind imaginable between age 11 and 13. And the irony is that our family doctor was a general practitioner. Back then, they did everything. The specialists were one thing, but I mean, he had an X-ray machine in his office, and he did a GI series in his office. And he sat down with my mom after the results came in, and he said, I'm looking at it, and I'll be damned. This looks like something called Superior Mesenteric Artery Syndrome. He says, but I can't, there's no way of diagnostically proving this. He says, there are things now available. This is 1973, mind you, called endoscopies. We ended up getting a reference to a Dr. Hiromi Shinya, who actually passed away only not too long ago. This man was a genius, a Japanese doctor who brought to America, he wrote the textbook on endoscopic medicine, essentially brought in what they called the Shinya snare, where they would pull polyps out in colonoscopies. People didn't have to have, major surgeries to have polyps removed. And yet he essentially taught all that first generation of people who developed endoscopic medicine. So we went to see Dr. Shinya, and he, in 20 minutes, he did what other doctors couldn't do in 3 years. I mean, he essentially diagnosed the problem. And I had to go for something called a duodenojejunectomy. And what they do is essentially, they can't cut out the obstruction, but to save your life, essentially, what they do is they bring the jejunum up and they do an anastomosis. And so the food bypasses. It's like you have a heart bypass. Mm-hmm. This is an intestinal bypass. Now, some food can make its way through that obstructed area, but it only loops around eventually and goes back out. So great. Wonderful. It saves my life, but something happens over the years. I have to say, I'll just pause for a minute and just tell you now what this is like. You have to understand that growing up as a kid, I knew nothing but illness. So when I had this surgery done, And lo and behold, there was a miraculous turnaround. I mean, it took a couple of months. We're seeing this amazing change. And I started gaining weight and feeling better. And it was an amazing change. It was miraculous. I mean, they saved my life.
When you say that you only knew illness as a child, how did it affect your daily life?
Well, I mean, I certainly attended school, but for example, as I was getting older, there were lots of times I was missing weeks at a time, sometimes months at a time. I was having, schoolwork being sent back and forth to the house. Teachers who were wonderful in terms of their understanding, doing, over the phone things. I'd show back up at school. My classmates were unbelievably supportive, the applause and the love and the hugs and the kisses. Never had a problem with people, making fun of me or anything like that. You talk about an environment where family and friends and fellow students, just an amazingly supportive environment, which I thank goodness for, because it could be very difficult. I'm not going to say there weren't those, for example, growing up who, would occasionally look at you and see, oh, you've gone through so many tests, they're not showing anything. It must be something mental. They say, oh, it's psychosomatic. That hurt. I'm not going to say it didn't hurt, because, there's something wrong. And people say, oh, let's hope they don't find anything. And be like, are you kidding me? It's like, I want them to, I don't want to hear I'm dying, but if I'm dying, all right, so I'm dying. But the point is that I want to hear that something's wrong, because this is not something I'm imagining. I can't possibly be treated diagnostically or cured, if that's the case, unless they find there's something wrong and I'm too sick. So, I was 69 pounds at the age of 13. I was withering away. So, it was tough. I'm not going to say it wasn't. But the irony is that once I got a taste of what health was like, it was wonderful. And when several years later, something went wrong with the bypass, it was almost as if you got a taste of health and now it was ripped from you. And I'd have to tell you, I became very depressed, because it was and it's one of those things where, if you didn't know health to begin with, you have nothing to compare it to. I had, fortunately, lots of laughter even growing up as a kid. I wasn't one of these kids that, moped. I had an uncle, my Uncle Sam. My dad died when I was 12, so he was like a second father to me. He was married to my mother's sister, my Aunt Georgia. My mom and her were very close sisters, and so he was like a second father to me. Great. In fact, I dedicated Russian Radical to him, and my mom got the first book. And unfortunately, both of them passed away before the books came out. By the third book, I says, I better make this like a multiple dedication, because it's like, I don't want people sentenced to a dedication. Nobody seems to make these books when they come out. So fortunately, the people that it was dedicated to survived the publication of the book. But getting back to this, so the simple fact is that, it was a really hard thing to swallow, so to speak, when I became so ill again. And I had to go through these rounds of tests all over again, finding what in God's name was going wrong. Essentially what happened is that there was a narrowing of the bypass of this anastomosis. So I was getting a situation where the food was now like racing through the system, what they call blind loop syndrome, okay? And now you start with this dumping syndrome, where you're essentially married to the bathroom. You have to start timing your meals. Do you eat? Do you not eat? If you're going to be traveling, you don't eat. You starve yourself for a day, even if it means 10 hours, 15 hours. If you're going to travel somewhere, make sure you're there for a week, because you can't do a day trip. It's impossible.
And that affects your global health, really. It's not only digestive, exactly. It's just everything.
Your whole being is affected. And you start to, you become very reluctant about going anywhere, traveling, even walking to a store, getting on a bike, even the motion of the bike. Is this going to affect, the motility of my intestines? It's brutal.
And did you get scared of the world in some ways?
It's scary. I wouldn't say it completely petrified me or demolished me. Mm-hmm. But I will tell you that now this becomes even more complicated, because there now becomes inordinately difficult side effects to this condition. They can't go back in there and reverse the bypass. Okay, because obviously this has saved your life. So now you can only deal with the side effects of what's happening. So at first they start saying, well, we'll give you Lomotil or like what's now Imodium, but that's a narcotic. You essentially you can't stop. It's like putting a dam up. You got a condition where you're having a dumping syndrome, so you can't put narcotics and say, okay, this is going to hold the dam back. It's just going to get worse because now it backs up the system when it finally does happen. I mean, you're going 13, 14, 15 times to the bathroom in one day, and you're dehydrating, you're losing electrolytes, I mean, you're completely demolished. No energy. It's brutal.
So were you alone at home? Were you with family?
Well, family, my sister and my mom and I were the ones living together. Mom worked, half a day. She was home. Most of my home life, I of course this was now by the time this happened, I was already this was happening during college actually. So I was fortunate. I guess I'm not quite sure exactly what year the second effect happened. It had to be during my undergraduate years. I was able to get through the undergraduate, graduate, and even the doctoral program. I tried to fake out the illness in terms of the eating perspective, but I also had amazing help from for example, the Office of Disabled Student Services. Great help from professors who would be willing to do, connecting me to lessons online, taking tests at home, what have you. Lots of help along the way. The thing is, though, that this became far more complicated because you see, as you're dehydrating now from this condition, now other effects are happening. So by 1995, my mom passed away in, I think it was April of 1995, and I was having back pain that whole year. She passed away after 5 years of lung cancer, dealing with lung cancer. I will say one thing as an aside, by the way, as a tangent. One amazing effect of having this condition or having problems medically is that you become fearless. I mean, doctors do not intimidate me. Hospitals do not intimidate me. I can go up, I could talk shop, as they say, with these guys. Nothing bothers me. And so, consequently, when mom got sick, talk about being a good caretaker. I was basically taking care of her all day when my sister was at work. She was a lifelong educator. She started as an English teacher, at the time she was a principal of a school in Staten Island. And then at night she essentially was taking care of mom so that I would be up all day. But, we were great caretakers. And part of that came from that medical history, being engulfed in a life of doctors and hospitals and whatnot. And so, yeah, that's one good side effect.
Did you live with your mother until she
Until she
passed?
passed, yeah. Actually,
Always.
I lived with my mom till 1995, and my sister and I continued to live together. In fact, we can talk about that a little later. She passed away just recently. We lived together essentially 3 months less, 63 years. So
Wow.
talk about close. But as I was saying, so the side effects of this condition were multiplying. That by 1995, I started to develop kidney stones. I didn't know this, had enormous back pain. And in November of 95, I doubled over and they diagnosed me with a kidney stone. And they had to take me into the hospital and do lithotripsy. Now, I mean, there's always something amusing about these things. Nothing amusing about a kidney stone. It's like when you're trying to pass, it's like giving birth to the planet Jupiter through a pinhole, all right? It's just being very blunt. Let's be honest here.
It's very
And,
painful.
someone said to me, oh, now you know what it's like for a woman to give birth. I says, if this is what it's like to give birth, it's a miracle that the human race survived because I can't believe that it's that bad. But hey, I don't know. I don't want to know. In any event, the horror of it was that the first time this happened to me, this was 95, they did this lithotripsy, which is they, with sound waves, break it up. He said, oh, you'll go home and you'll pass sediment. It'll be okay. And it'll maybe a little discomfort, but there's no problem. Well, I come home and I don't think an hour and a half passed, and this was not sediment. I collapsed. I don't know what happened. I called my brother because my sister wasn't home. I said, you've got to get me back. I said, something happened here. The pain was excruciating. I could barely breathe. And I was rushed back to the hospital. For 1 week, they were flooding me with fluids, IV fluids, and giving me morphine doses. I mean, it might as well have been, doses of water. It did nothing. It maybe, calmed the situation down for like 20 minutes, and then I was back into excruciating pain.
That's crazy.
Eventually, about a week in, they had to put a stent in. I will tell you that I had not one, but since then, I've had 8 lithotripsies because of this chronic formation of kidney stones due to chronic dehydration because of the intestinal problem. So the only good news is that fortunately the technology has gotten better. Now when they attack these things with lithotripsies, they become sand. In fact, the horrible thing is, I will be very honest with you, is that it's a shame that the horrible experience happened with the first lithotripsy, because now it put the fear of God into me. It's like, oh my God, this is going to happen I can't do this. It's a nightmare. You say to yourself, this is horrifying, Another thing that happened was that because of this chronic dumping syndrome, you start to literally tear yourself apart. It got so bad that I had to end up getting blood transfusions and IV iron supplementations because of the bleeding. I must have gone through a total of more than close to 30 ligation procedures to close off hemorrhoidal bleeding. At the end, they had to do something called radiation impulses to close off this bleeding. I mean, I dropped, I think, 30 pounds from the amount of blood loss, and it was pretty bad. In addition to that, I even had inguinal hernia surgeries because of the intestinal strain from this constant back and forth to the bathroom business. So the effect, you say to yourself, okay, so you had SMAS, but that wasn't the whole story. The whole story is that, yeah, they saved your life, but now the side effects of the surgery and all the other things that have happened, this ripple effect, has compounded the problem, and you end up in a situation where, you just got to roll with the punches. You just do what you have to do.
And there was a lot of medication involved. Is there side effects to medication? Addiction?
Well, no. Fortunately, I will
also...
tell you this much: they haven't done much. Didn't have much in the way of medications, because one thing I'll tell you one thing: I have very high tolerance for pain. I never had any problems with addiction with medications, thank goodness. They did find me with other issues that were they were not really related. I mean, I have some on blood pressure medications, but they discovered that I had a hypothyroidism, so they put me on thyroid medication. But the condition is what it is, and I do what's necessary. You learn to adapt. It's very interesting. You don't know how your life's going to go in terms of people have asked me, so you've been sick your whole life. You've been an author. Do you think that being sick and being home influenced you being an author? I mean, I always loved writing. I was writing a diary from age 11. Okay. I was sick, and it was a very therapeutic thing for me. I think from age 11 to, let's say, 2008, I think I stopped writing because by that point it was social media. So everyone was dumping stuff on social media. But the thing is that I find writing to be it's very passionate, but it's also cathartic. Mm-hmm. It's a therapeutic. I always loved school, but I also loved my summer vacations. And yet I think that to a certain extent, who knows? It's very hard to know what would have happened in the absence of, this condition. But the fact is that I count my blessings that I am a person who does love writing, and that it is essentially a solitary thing. You sit in front of, well, when I did my dissertation, it was a typewriter. And that was a nightmare because, the computer corrects a mistake. With the dissertation, if you made even one error on a page, you weren't allowed to use correct type. You had to pull the page out and start all over again. So that was a pain. But point is that, it was something I loved doing, the writing. To a certain extent, as I said, I count my blessings that it's been an activity that's gone well with the disability. It's like I didn't have to go to an office. Clearly I could not have worked in a normal work setting. Now, of course, this kind of writing hasn't made me a millionaire, unfortunately, but you roll with the punches. I had the fortune of being supported by family and friends, and had to do what I had to do in terms of the system that exists. It's called disability. You cannot exist. I don't want to go off on a tangent here, but to be very blunt, the American healthcare system has wonderful things about it. Clearly, the doctors that were here were able to diagnose me in ways that perhaps they were not able to do in other countries. A man like Dr. Shinya came to America from Japan for a reason. I have no doubt that American medicine has led to many tremendous breakthroughs in medical care. The delivery of that care, however, is a nightmare. And I think it has gotten even more nightmarish as time has gone on. The cost of my care was absolutely destructive to my family's finances. The premiums we were paying in terms of health insurance were absolutely insane. And it got so that it almost brought us to the brink of bankruptcy. We were in a lot of debt, which we worked ourselves out of. But that's the kind of thing you just don't want to see happen to a family. I can talk about that more a little later on when I talk about my sister, but it's one of these subjects that I'd like to return to because it is a horrifying situation no one should ever find themselves in. It's bad enough you have to deal with an illness. If you cannot get the care you need, it's essentially a death sentence.
What percentage of income is healthcare? Approximately.
Well, fortunately, I'm at this stage of my life. I'm on disability. I'm getting Medicare disability.
But before then?
Before then, I wouldn't even know what kind of percent. I mean, 40%. You're talking about an enormous cost. It's huge. How do you live? How do you pay rent? How do you pay utilities? How do you just survive? It was destroying the family, And at some point, you're being reminded your premiums are going through the roof because you see you're not well, so they keep raising your premiums every year. I mean, that's it. And clearly, I know there's a lot of history to why the American healthcare system's out of whack. If you're not given any choice but to seek out disability because the entire system is rigged, it's a nightmare. You've got a situation where you had a history of monopoly medical licensure problems, monopoly and oligopolistic pricing in the health insurance industry, programs that were introduced to help, supposedly to lower costs and ending hiking costs, doctors having to hire whole staffs to deal with, massive changes in the insurance laws. I understand why the costs have gone up, but the costs go up, they're passed on to the consumer, who is the patient, and if the patient can't survive, what's the point? It is a mixture of private and public. The public option at this point is necessary. It's just a necessity. There are people who argue, certainly within libertarian circles, that it wouldn't be necessary if we got rid of the medical licensure, if we got rid of the oligopolistic pricing in the health insurance industry. All these things are very nice. We could do whatever we can to reduce, for example, big pharma's holds on patents and whatnot to bring down the cost of prescriptions. All these things can be done, but you can't flip a switch. We're not in a light switch situation. And if you're in that situation where you're dealing with the conditions as they exist, which, by the way, I can throw in a point, it's a dialectical principle. You have to deal with the conditions that exist in order to think about what kinds of social changes you're going to bring about. You don't start with what the ideal is. You start with the real. You have to deal with what exists. What are the conditions that exist? These are the conditions that exist. They put you in a position where you must seek out what is available to you. I don't blame people for seeking out disability, for seeking out Medicare or Medicaid. These are the conditions that exist. What do you do other than die? So yeah, there's got to be some kind of, I don't have all the answers. I could just say that, given that these are the conditions that exist, you have to do what's necessary to keep yourself alive. And yeah, there are things that can be done on both ends in terms of taking away those privileges that government does grant to the healthcare industry, which causes monopoly pricing, while also dealing with public options so that people that can't afford it can in fact get the care they need.
Is your health related to the choice to live with your mother and sister your whole life?
Well, I'll tell you the truth. It wasn't so much a choice, it's just what we did. We had our relationships where we could have, for example, who could have gotten married along the way. They didn't work out. So you stay together. You're a loving family. You're very supportive of one another. It was just home, So it wasn't so much a choice as it was just how things were. We definitely, there was a point at which I may have had a relationship that could have taken me out of New York, but it didn't work out. I stayed home after Mom passed on in 1995. My sister and I continued living together up until the time she passed away, which was in November of 2022. So loving, great relationship. Brother and sister, siblings, best friends, terrifically supportive of one another.
Can you tell me about your sister starting at childhood?
She's great, great sister. First of all, there was 8 years between us. So my brother was the firstborn. So he was out of the house essentially by the time I was really born.
So
And
he's how many years older than you?
oh geez, 21 years. Yeah, so
That's a generation.
this is generation. Interestingly, mom, I'm convinced that was a mistake. I mean, she was born on February 20th, 1919. I was born on February 17th, 1960. So right before she turned 41. I don't know about that. But the point is
The
that I
last
was a
one for the
big
road.
birthday gift to her, right? Let's face it, right? 3 days away from her 41st birthday. And the thing is that, my sister, because there was an 8-year gap, interestingly, we each had our own childhood. It's like because there was such a gap between us, we had the capacity of our parents to raise us as kids, and so it was wonderful. But because she was 8 when I was born, we were living in the same house, so we be very close, very close. We played games growing up. We took pictures growing up. We went to Coney Island, which was an amusement park here in Brooklyn. We did everything together. She was also a very intelligent person and very much valued education, as did my family. She was actually the first college graduate in our entire extended family.
What did your parents do?
Well, they were blue collar workers. Mom got her high school diploma. Dad didn't. Dad actually started out as an eye setter in a doll factory. Eventually worked for Transworld Airlines, in the cargo area. Mom was in the garment industry, sewing veils most of her life until later on when she became like a school aide. But essentially these were, blue collar workers. But they wanted, we were not a very well off family at all. We were very I'm not going to say we were dirt poor, but essentially the situation here was such that, we just did not have money at all. We always had food on the table. Mom always used to say, we may not have money in this house. We may not go on vacations much, but we'll always have food on this table, and we ate very well. Well, you have to. In a Greek-Italian family, if you don't eat well, there's a real problem here, okay? But we always put, and our get-togethers on Sundays were family get-togethers. Sunday meals seemed to start, early in the day and didn't end till at night. And my brother and sister-in-law were musicians. He's a jazz guitarist. She's a singer. So, people would come over and there'd be jam sessions going into the night, music playing all the time. It was a very loving, musical, beautiful family. But my sister went on, she became a teacher of English, I guess by the time she was 19 or 20. And that's around 1969, 1970, 71. She started out as an English teacher in Brooklyn Technical High School. So she was not much older than the students. But she eventually went on to become the coordinator of student affairs there, student activities, I'm sorry. She also was a coach of the cheerleaders. She was a booster as a high school student at Lafayette High School. So she loved the cheering squads, and she coached the cheering squads. And she coached a dance team that she created. They eventually went on to win national championships. And so she went on to become an assistant principal at Brooklyn Tech. And then eventually went over, I think it was in 1990, she became principal of New Dorp High School in Staten Island. She left there years later to become a deputy superintendent of the Brooklyn and Staten Island schools, and then eventually went on to the superintendency of high school admissions at the board at what was then the Department of Education. So her whole life, even after she retired in 2010 from that position, she went eventually back to Brooklyn Tech, where she started, and became executive director of the Brooklyn Tech Alumni Foundation. So her whole life, I mean, we're talking about a 50-plus year career in education. Well, naturally, someone who valued education as much as she did, was a tremendous guide for me. When I was deciding on what high school to go to, she was saying, there are a lot of high schools to go to. You don't want to go to a zone school. She says, well, even back before that, we had something called SP, 2-year SP, where you could supposedly skip a grade. Because I was born in February, I was kind of like getting into kindergarten later than most because we start in September. She said, you don't need 8th grade. She says, you can actually combine 7th, 8th, and 9th grade by going to your SP. So I went from 7th to 9th grade at my middle school, junior high school. I got back on the on schedule. So by the time I got to the high school level, she said, you really ought to consider going to a place called John Dewey High School. It was probably the best choice I ever made. The school was ironically named after a pragmatist philosopher who Ayn Rand would have hated. But it was a very amazing school. They eliminated grades. This is pass-fail. And there was no attention paid to grades. I didn't actually care about grades much. I was always a good student, but it wasn't the primary reason why. It wasn't, I have to be a 90. I wasn't, oh my God, I didn't get 100. It was nothing like that. But this school even magnified the issue of learning and individualized learning, so that if you had a passion, they did everything, not only the program, but the teachers also who were at the school, to nourish your loves and your passions. And of course, my passion at the time, I continued with social studies and history and politics. I loved it. I mean, I loved the school. It was so wonderful. Some amazing teachers came out of that. Brian McCarthy, Ira Zornberg, who actually taught there. It was the first course taught on the high school level in the entire United States about the Holocaust. And he wrote a couple of books, one about the Quakers and the Holocaust 10 years later. An absolutely magnificent course that made a tremendous impact on me. He made an impact on me. I took an advanced placement history course. They had a law institute there, which was fantastic. So I did legal studies. It was a wonderful education. I mean, we used to do independent courses. I took one on the Renaissance. It was wonderful, wonderful stuff. Music, art, everything, I did, although I will say, I did drop the music part of it. I was doing violin in elementary school and middle school. When I got to the high school level, I said, maybe I'll continue this. And I walked into the classroom and we all picked up the instrument, and I picked it up. We were going to do scales, and I was surrounded by prodigies. And I said, okay, my brother's the guitarist. He's the musician in the family. I'm leaving this behind. So long. I'm out of here.
And all of these various classes, that was in high school.
This is in high school, yeah.
It's
amazing.
So enriching.
Amazing school. Amazing school.
It's wonderful. And did you feel that school was a way for you to kind of get to know the world? Because I feel like your childhood was a lot of indoors.
Very much so. It was terrific. Not to mention the fact it had a campus. It had a real live campus. You can go out on a nice warm spring or summer day and sit around, and you had independent study hours. One thing that people used to say, I bless you, you didn't have to take gym. Well, I didn't have to take gym because of my health problems. But you know what? Not taking gym actually helped me out in the sense that the independent study, or the time I spent, just doing things on my own.
It's freedom.
It was freedom, right. There was none of that, physical education, you have another 2 hours of, it's not that I didn't exercise, I had to do what I can do, but I couldn't do what they were doing for obviously, for health reasons, but there was a freedom involved. And, for some, I'm not going to say it's for everyone. There are some students that do need a more structured environment. There's no doubt about it. I had people tell me, oh my God, you can't possibly take that. I couldn't get any direction. And it's not the case you couldn't get direction. It's just that, it helps if you had direction, and it helps if you had some passion, because then they nourish that passion. So I was very fortunate where that was concerned. So my sister had it right. And then I applied to several schools. She told me, NYU is a great school for you. I went to NYU. I always tell people I bleed violet because that's the school color. I got all 3 degrees at NYU. Again, great choices at NYU.
What did you study?
Well, the thing that was amazing about that, as I said, I discovered Ayn Rand as a senior in high school. And the wonderful thing about New York University was that some of the literature that came out of Rand was the Austrian School of Economics. And NYU happened to have been the center of Austrian economics. I mean, it was like Austrian economics writ large. They had an Austrian economics program. So though my primary major course of study was the history honors program as an undergraduate, I also did politics as a second major. And because of the Austrian presence, I took a third major. So I did a triple major and took economics as the third major. I was involved with the Students for a Libertarian Society. So we were protesting against the imposition of draft registration during the Jimmy Carter years. So I was an annoyance to a lot of people. So it was nice being an activist and a student, writing for the school newspaper and the politics journal that I edited at the time. Historian, I contributed an article there. I did my history honors thesis there on, of all things, on labor history, which is not something you usually see in amongst the libertarian school, libertarian thought.
Did you ever get interested in disability studies?
Well, I didn't, ironically. I figured I lived it. I knew quite a bit about it. I had an education, a life education in it. But it certainly made me so much more empathetic as a human being toward those who had disabilities. I mean, I will tell you, I'm not exactly, Mr. Muscle Man here, okay? I mean, average guy. But if I saw someone being bullied, even in the hallway, I've got a big mouth. And I mean, I'd stick up for people, and sometimes people would like, oh, big guy. I usually say people get hysterical because I can be very mild mannered, but I have a certain line, and I say if you pass that line, the Sicilian in me comes out, or the Brooklyn, what have you. And once that line is passed, it's like I go blind. It's over. Run for the hills. So, and they see that that level of shall we say excitement, enthusiasm, what have you, and they run. There's something that goes to the core of me when I see that kind of mistreatment of people. I just cannot. I can't deal with it, and I speak up.
As a kid or as a teenager or growing up, were there other kids who had certain challenges like you?
Well,
the same ones,
the same ones, but certainly people that people that were suffering from all sorts of problems. People that had leg braces or were in wheelchairs and stuff, and always befriended people. Never thought twice. At the time they used to have, in my very early grades, they didn't have special ed programs for those who were had learning disabilities, and sometimes they would merge these classes with people with learning disabilities, and so you had people that were making fun of those who had various issues, cerebral palsy, what have you, and I found that to be, not to use the expression turn my stomach. I found it so upsetting that kids would be making fun of other children who had problems. I would go out of my way to befriend kids like that. It would have so upset me. It really did. It so upset me. So I've always had a very strong empathy for anyone going through any kind of problem. And, it's beyond comprehension to me that human beings can be so cruel, and yet it's part of the human condition. Cruelty just seems to be part of who we are. I'm not saying I've never been cruel in my life. I'm not an angel. We're not saints. We've all had our flaws. But it's not something I don't go out of my way. If I was ever cruel, it's almost always by omission or by some mistake or some stupidity, But to think that I'd actually go out of my way to be cruel to somebody is something that's just foreign to my whole vocabulary,
You said earlier that you always had good relationship with your schoolmates and that you never had any of that mean behavior towards you. Do you think that there's something about being kind of in the gray zone of your disability is not visible? So you were out of school, you were you definitely had severe challenges.
And let me tell you, that also had a very big problem trying to get disability. Mm-hmm. Because I will tell you that, I had to actually go through a lawyer. Mm-hmm. Because even the judge says, you got a PhD, for Christ's sake, how are you a disabled person? How did that even happen? And it's like, well, I got it through because I was with, the Office of Disabled Student Services. I got help from professors and students and classmates and whatnot. They don't see you. You say, they look at you, say, you've got two legs, you've got two eyes, you could see, you could talk, you're clearly intelligent, you could write. What's wrong with you? They don't see what's inside of you, And, so that made it very difficult.
How did you defend yourself, and how did you talk to that judge?
Well, I don't want to say what I was saying inside, but outside I was very, very calm. My lawyers even said, look, he says, you need to speak directly to the issues. And I did. But with all due respect, by the time all the medical evidence was in, the government lawyers got up at the final hearing and said, Your Honor, we cannot fight this disability case, the evidence here is overwhelming. This person is suffering from a disability. And so, of course, the judge had to be playing devil's advocate and say, well, suppose he writes a best-selling book. And they said, well, Your Honor, the odds of that happening are very low. And if he does, more power to him. But, we don't think that's going to happen. They were right about that. I'm not saying the books didn't do well, but I'm certainly not a millionaire. Let's put it that way.
Meaning that a person who has a disability can't do great?
Right, of course. Exactly. So point is that obviously the disability case was won, but, not without, again, a struggle. It's not something I even wanted to do. I mean, it's a very hard thing accepting, I'm not disabled. It's like, I've got a condition. I'll deal with it. I'm getting through school. See, a friend of mine actually sat me down and said, look, I know you have your principles. This idea about libertarianism, not wanting to accept, quote unquote, aid from the government. Your family's paid, my sister alone, millions of dollars in taxes over a lifetime. You've put in your time. You go to a store, there's sales taxes. You go to tolls, you've got tax. Everything you do has got taxes. There are sales, income taxes. We didn't have property, never owned property, but everything you do has got a tax on it. For God's sake, what is wrong with you? He says, you're clearly disabled. You can't function. He says, there are people that are far, far less, quote unquote, disabled than you are who are able to get disability. There's something wrong with you. You need to go to get yourself some disability here. You can't even afford to pay for the health insurance to keep yourself well. There's something wrong. The system's wrong. So you have to do what you have to do. Dialectically, we would say we're milking the inner contradictions of the system. You have to do what you have to do. There's just no way around it.
And why didn't you want help from the government?
It's not. I think there was this. Sadly, ideology can be a straitjacket, and I learned that very, very early on. In a very ideal sense, libertarians like to think about the non-aggression quote principle or axiom that no people should initiate force against one another. No one should initiate force against another. And we understand all this, but we live in a society where taxes are taken. That's considered theft. Okay, they're taking taxes from you. This is a society that we're all going to live by rules. Rules are in some sense going to be imposed, no matter what kind of social order you're living in. So there was a part of me that was trying to say, well, if you take benefits from the government, they're taking that from other people and they're giving it to you, and they're taking it at the point of a gun from someone else. And well, okay, but you're also walking down a government street and you're using a government post office, and you're going to a store and paying a sales tax.
Public transportation.
Public transportation. There's
that's how we all
in New York
participate.
City. At some point, you've got to draw a line. It's like it's okay to do those things, but it's not okay to. It's insane. And you have to just say to yourself, look, I live in the real world, guys. I cannot survive in this system. Period. I cannot survive. If I don't have Medicare, I'm not going to make it. I can't pay the health insurance premiums. I'm going to die. So, I'll die on principle? That's insane. It's not a question of so much violating principle as the fact that, again, living in the real world. We all would like to see a world that is different. But you do not die as a martyr on principle. What you do is you use the system for whatever system you have. Ayn Rand herself was born in the Soviet Union, for Christ's sake. Okay, she went to a public university. She got tuition free at the University of Leningrad. Well, actually, they had to pay, I think, small tuition fees at the time. In fact, before she was even able to get into university, because she was a Jewish student, there was enormous, of course, during the Tsarist era, there was enormous restrictions on Jews in Russia. So fortunately, that was eliminated for her, even on women, on girls and women. So she benefited from a lot of things as a person who was in the Soviet Union. But even in her later years, she argued, on principle, that those who pay taxes have a right, on the basis of that alone, to get any benefits, whether it be unemployment benefits, Social Security, workman's compensation, whatever it is. You're giving into a system, even government scholarships. She took Social Security herself. And I don't see any contradiction in it. These are the conditions that exist, but again, if you're caught in an ideological straitjacket, which is a problem, you have to be grounded in the conditions that exist. And I'm going to give a shout out actually to a professor that was very important to my intellectual evolution, which was at NYU. Because it wasn't just the Austrian school and the free market economics that opened my eyes. Ironically, my mentor at the university, at New York University, was Bertell Ollman, who was a Marxist. Now, Bertell, he's a wonderful author, wrote a book called Alienation, on Marx's theory of alienation under capitalism. He wrote a book on dialectical investigations, quite a number of publications. Great professor, great teacher. And ironically, he and I met when I was an undergraduate. He loved the fact that I was such a kind of a student radical, but I wasn't a Marxist. I was a libertarian radical. And he sat me down. He says, he said, I had a lot of experience with libertarians in my career. He said, I was in the Peace and Freedom Party with Murray Rothbard, who I knew. And Rothbard I met through the Students for Libertarian Society. He was a very big influence on me in those years. In fact, he was the one who actually told me at the time to go ahead and do that history honors thesis on labor history. He says, nobody's doing it. He says, one thing you do is you kind of carve a niche for yourself. It's always very important to do that. But Bertell was very, very important to me. And he says, I learned a lot about libertarianism through Rothbard and Liggio. He says, for God's sake, I was a Volcker Fellow under Friedrich Hayek at the University of Chicago, so I have enormous respect for libertarians. He says, but I think you can learn a lot from Marxism. And I think that you should consider, in terms of your graduate school and doctoral education, your choices, not so much where you go, but who you want to study with. That's more important. He was essentially inviting me to study with him. And I made the choice to stay at NYU, aside from the fact that they gave me, it was essentially tuition free. They gave me full scholarships on the master's level and the doctoral level. In fact, they gave me full scholarships even on the undergraduate level.
That's because you had you had grades.
Terrific grades. And quite honestly, I had a $400 National Direct Student Loan that I paid back on the day I graduated. So I was enormously grateful to the university. I was accepted to Columbia. I didn't go. Actually, the interesting thing is that at one point I was considering a dual degree path where you get the JD, the Juris Doctor law degree, plus let's say at the time I was thinking about a graduate degree in either history or politics. And the irony is I had to sit through the grueling LSAT exam, which went on for 8 hours. And I said, to me, toward the end, it was just checking off answers. It was insane. Standardized tests measure some things. They don't measure all things. I never thought I did that great on standardized tests. But after that experience, I was accepted in terms of the dual programs to all the graduate schools. I didn't get accepted to any of the law schools because my LSAT grades weren't good enough. So I took the course of study with NYU's program in politics, and Bertell was my mentor. I learned so much from him, especially on dialectical method. And what was important there for me is that I made explicit the fact that dialectical method was not something that was owned by the Marxists. It goes back centuries, back to the ancient Greeks. Aristotle, in fact, was the first theoretician, the first person to write the textbook on dialectical thinking. And essentially all that dialectical thinking is always looking at the wider context of any problem. We never look at a problem isolated as if it's an atom. Every problem is related to every other problem or every other issue. Each issue has relations to other issues, other events. And we look at these things not in terms of only their relations within a system, but also over time. So I looked at that and I said, my goodness, Ayn Rand had very similar ways of looking at the world. And so it is ironic that it was Bertell Ollman who said to me, well, she was raised in the Soviet Union under Marxist professors. If I were you, I would think about that. And that is what led me to eventually do Ayn Rand, the Russian Radical, because I did enormously important historical research on Rand's education in the Soviet Union and eventually learned so much about her. It was an ongoing project that certainly, I would say, began with Russian Radical, but did not end because it opened up a whole field of studies. And I learned so much about what she was taught how she was taught, I think, influenced her enormously in how she the kind of thinking she had.
How was she taught? And
But
what was her thinking?
and that kind of thinking was always, again, never looking at things atomistically, always looking at the human being not only as an integrated whole, but as part of a larger context. We are not isolated from this larger context. So, for example, if she looked at the problem of, well, racism, okay, it was never looked at as strictly a personal issue. Well, there's a difference between this race and that race. We have to look at the cultural conditions that have led to the prominence of racism in society, the political and economic conditions that reinforce racism in a society. So all these structural issues, cultural issues, personal issues, all these things coming together in terms of our understanding of this particular social problem. And she essentially filtered almost every analysis of every social problem through this same lens, looking at it through different vantage points, different levels of generality. And this is important because if you don't get the whole picture. You don't get the whole context. So you're losing something. And so that's how you look at the world. You keep shifting your vantage point, shifting your perspective.
That I agree, but Ayn Rand is also very much about self-empowerment, really.
Yes.
In a very, I think selfish, but in a very
Yes, well, and she says the virtue of
individualistic.
selfishness. Yeah, and of course, and the point here is, I think, is sometimes very, very much lost. Yes, it's very important. The self is so important. But she also maintained that in order for the self to be nourished, it is important that there be environmental, educational, cultural, political, economic conditions that nourish those things. She railed against, for example, the educational system that stunted the individual's capacity to think for themselves, inculcating things like authority and obedience, not being able to put two and two together, repetition drills instead of actually critical thinking. And if thinking is so important to your survival as an individual, to your flourishing as an individual, even to your being in touch with your emotions as an individual, and that kind of educational system is stunting your cognitive and your emotional intelligence, you're not going to flourish as an individual. So it's never, selfishness is important, or rational self-interest, as she called it, was important, but never outside the context of those things and those factors that would nourish your ability to do that. Which is why she used to say, well, in her view, she talked about capitalism, the unknown ideal, as being the social system that would be most conducive to nourishing the individual to flourish in a social context. Now, one can argue as to whether that's the case or not. Certainly, historically, her vision of capitalism never existed. That's why it's an unknown ideal.
But her thinking suggests that you have to be able to rationalize what goes on in life, which is not a reality. Not everybody is able to. And that's if we relate to disability, for example, and if we relate to people who have intellectual, cognitive, mental disabilities, they are impeached.
That's right, they are. And I think that sometimes what happens is also, this is unfortunate because I think that, you can look at it in two ways. I think there are those who are so caught up in that one aspect of Ayn Rand. I think it's taking an aspect of Ayn Rand's thinking and reifying as if it's the whole. And that's a problem with any thinker. I mean, I always say, and that's why I don't identify myself as an objectivist. I'm a Rand scholar, just as I'm a Rothbard scholar, or a Hayek scholar, or a Marx scholar. I always say, I try not to use the expletive, but my view is you take what gems of wisdom you can from every thinker and every school of thought, every tradition you can, and move the F on, because not every person is going to give you everything. And by the way, it's like that even in human relationships. I like saying, someone's my number one or my best friend, but I can have a couple of best friends, if you know what I mean. And there's, just as this friend may speak to something in my personality and bring out certain things about who I am in a way that this other friend doesn't. That's why we have multifaceted human relationships, because our relationships speak to different parts of who we are.
Absolutely.
And not every person, not one person can bring out everything. Thank goodness. If we put all of our eggs in one basket and that one person drops, we're dead.
And the world
You
would be
know,
small.
we live, the world would be very small. So I actually am nourished by the fact that we live in a world of such a multiplicity of wonderful, what could be wonderful social relations. Now, there is a problem with those who I think take Rand and that individualism to a reified extent where it's solipsistic, it's atomistic. I don't think that the essence of Rand is that, but I do think that there are aspects in her thought that one can draw out and become caught up in it, and I think it becomes very harmful. And let's go further. The woman also had a very strong personality, which is why she, I think, those around her created a cult of personality, and that movement, so far as it was, essentially collapsed under the weight of that cult of personality. Now, there were lots of reasons why it fell apart, but I mean, she had a relationship with Nathaniel Branden that was, not known to the world. It was known to the spouses involved. It was a crushing relationship when it ended between Branden and her. That schism that happened in 1968, essentially the entire objectivist world was like collapsed. I mean, I can't even tell you the damage it did to people emotionally. I fortunately was only 8 years old, but the stories that I was told of the people that the damage that was done to people during that period was enormously harmful.
What kind of damage?
Well,
How did one
I think it was
relationship?
just, for example, the breakup that happened between Brandon and her, she essentially came out with an article called in The Objectivist, which she and Brandon co-edited, and she had denounced him as essentially a moral monster for having done XYZ, certainly never stating that she had had a relationship with him, a romantic one that had fallen apart. She simply asked people to believe, to accept her word. A number of people signed on to it, broke their relationships with Nathaniel Branden.
And they were both kind of co-leading this movement.
Essentially, yeah. Well, Branden in many ways was essentially, one of the architects of the movement, perhaps the practical architect of that movement. I mean, he essentially started the lectures on objectivism in the late 1950s, and from that began the Objectivist as a periodical. All of her nonfiction work was published in the Objectivist, and eventually anthologies of those articles were published as books unto themselves. So in many ways, Branden was as much a part of the birth of the so-called Objectivist movement as Rand as anyone else. I mean, he was responsible for the organization, for the publication, for courses. I mean, these were courses that were being offered on tape, that were being heard on submarines, offered in cities around the world, something that had never been done before.
How popular was this movement? How many people do you think were involved in?
I mean, there were thousands upon thousands. And if you want to be technical, I mean, hundreds, millions of people were affected by her books, no doubt about it. I mean, even Hillary Clinton said she went through an Ayn Rand stage. I mean, people, were so empowered by her stories of individuals rising against the tide. And then, of course, you see books like We the Living, for example, which is the most autobiographical of her novels, which, by the way, speaks to the social conditions, for example, the ones we were just talking about. This is a book about how a woman, Kira, who's the main protagonist, is, essentially in a triangular relationship with two men, ironically, as Rand was. So she has a relationship with two men, and the conditions under which these people exist is slowly crushing their souls and crushing everyone around them. She originally had named the book Airtight because totalitarianism of any kind will just suck out the oxygen from the social environment such that human freedom and personal flourishing becomes impossible. And the conflicts of interest, you cannot do anything without hurting someone else. So it's ironic that a film came out of that in the 1942. Was a two-part film. It starred Alida Valli, Rossana Brazzi, big hit, and eventually apparently was withdrawn by the fascist authorities because they started to get a little bit too nervous that there was extolling the virtues of the individual against the state, and that resonated in a way that they did not want to hear. So it was as much speaking against fascist dictatorship as it was so-called, Marxist communist dictatorships. So, but anyway, yeah. So bringing this back to the essentials, the movement essentially imploded. She dies in 1982, and then what is born as the Ayn Rand Institute. It started out as something that looked like it was going to nourish objectivist scholarship, and there started to be the infighting and the purges, and if you didn't follow the party line, this wasn't good. People weren't given access to documents at the Ayn Rand archives if they didn't sign a certain loyalty test. Just insanity from where I stand. I'm not even gonna. I don't want to even get too much into it. I've had a lot to say about it in print, but it's the kind of thing that you say to yourself. Ayn Rand used to say you have to trust the judgment of your own mind, and then you have a situation where you have to trust the judgment of Ayn Rand or whoever the leader is. If that is what ends up becoming the signaling, it is the complete opposite of what the philosophy is supposed to be teaching you. So I would never have survived in that movement 2 minutes. I was fortunate enough to have studied Ayn Rand independently. I didn't learn it under the auspices of any organization, and to that extent, I think I was better off.
We talked a little bit earlier about caregiving. Yeah. How is that a part of your relationship with your family?
Well, I will say, as I mentioned before, my mom had been diagnosed with lung cancer back in 1990. So my sister and I both were caregivers in that sense. And fortunately, speaking as we did before about, what was available to her, Mom qualified for Medicaid. So we were able to get a visiting nurse here for quite a number of hours each day, who helped out enormously. Now I can rail again, I'll get on my soapbox. Caregiving is important, but the conditions under which you give care are also important. And one of the things I've always said is, you cannot take care of anyone or anything unless you take care of yourself first. You've heard the story of being on the airplane. There's a problem, the oxygen masks come down, you put the oxygen mask on yourself first before you give it to the next person. Now, sometimes we forget that because the people we love, we want to help. But I learned very early on, it is extremely important that you've got to take care of your own health, or else you lose the capacity to take care of anyone. The difference is that when Mom was sick, I was 30 and 35 years old. Now, my sister was an educator for 50 plus years. She got a pension, she got a salary, and she did not qualify for Medicaid. So, when she ended up in November of 2020, almost dying on me, we had a situation where they didn't think she was going to last a month. I'll never forget it. It was November 12th, the night of November 12th, I had called EMS, and they said, she's not well, you need to get to the hospital. And she refused to go.
Why?
She was petrified because she was in the middle of a pandemic. And I think she just, in this city especially, New York was demolished by the COVID pandemic. And you can hear anyone you want tell you stories that, that they were inflating the numbers. I lived on this block. I wrote 20 some odd installments of a series on the impact of COVID. And I can tell you, I was seeing people dying to the right and the left of me, ambulances coming down this neighborhood, all hours of the night. They had so many bodies being lined up in this area. There were U-Haul trucks that they had bodies that were being thrown in. And I don't want to hear from anyone that it was being inflated. I know it was happening in this city. Now, I suspect that a part of the cause of that was that we were hit first and hard. And this is also the tourist attraction of the world. We had a lot of people coming into this city. In fact, I suspect that even right before the holidays, it wasn't until mid-March that there was this shutdown here, but I think that stuff was going on long before that. You think about the tree going up, around the Thanksgiving holidays, Thanksgiving parades, hundreds of millions of people on the subways, which became a transmission belt for the virus. I mean, it was insane. So yeah, by November of 2020, we're talking, my sister was working virtually out of the home. We were workmates. She was working here, I was working at the table, and And she wasn't well, as I said, so she refused to go. But the next morning when I awoke, she was non-responsive. She was almost dead. And we rushed her to the hospital. She had a lot of things wrong with her. A lot of things were wrong. Ultimately, she ended up with spinal surgery in mid-March because her vertebrae were collapsing. She couldn't walk. She was in rehab for 4.5 months. These problems affected everything from the liver to the kidneys, you name it. Everything was going wrong with this woman. And by the time October of 2021 came, I was taking care of her for almost a full year at that point. I was run down. We go back to the hospital and they tell me, your sister doesn't have a month to live, if that. There's nothing we can do. So she'll have to go on palliative care. Do you want her to go into an inpatient or in-home hospice? Well, I believed that I wanted to bring my sister home to die. That's essentially what it came down to. I knew that this is something that she would have wanted. The thought of her dying in a hospital was something I didn't want to see happen. We brought her home. And she had a strong heart and a strong will to live. But Medicare gave us 4 hours a day, 5 days a week for home health aides, which means the other 20 hours, not on weekends, by the way, the other 20 hours, I was taking care of her.
How are those hours counted?
They're counted like from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. or 8 a.m. to 12 p.m.
No, meaning how do they decide that they're going to get 4 hours?
Because that's what they allow. You see, that's what's considered what Medicaid gives for hospice. Now, if she had qualified for Medicaid, she might have gotten an additional 10 hours.
How would she qualify? What does it take to qualify?
What does it take to qualify? You see, here's the issue. Because she was getting a pension and she was getting social at the time, she was getting her income. She was getting income because she was working at Brooklyn Tech. They consider her wealthy. Great. You're caught in between a rock and a hard place. You're considered too wealthy for Medicaid, but you're certainly not wealthy enough to pay for your own health care. And this is a woman, mind you, that, as far as I'm concerned, didn't take care of herself enough. And what I mean by that is that she gave her life, literally, figuratively and literally, to her career, because she loved kids. She loved children. It was her life. She lived for her children, for the kids she taught. And thousands upon thousands of people tell you that the impact she made on them changed their lives, okay? So we ended up in a situation where, she essentially had enough sick days and vacation days to pay for a few months of salary. But by the time that was over, there was nowhere else to go. She demolished her savings. And by the time October came, okay, October of 2021, a month did not become a month. She lasted 13 months. By the time of March 2022, we had to beg for money on GoFundMe. A woman who worked her entire life could not get Medicaid. We could not get more than we were paying out of pocket to get more home health aides because I was going back and forth to doctors at that point. I had pulled out my back, pulled out my shoulder, pulled out my thumb. I was getting heart palpitations that the doctor says it's only because you're not getting any sleep and there's stress in your life. He says, if you're getting 3 hours sleep a night, that's broken up. He says, you're going to end up dead before your sister. If you don't get help in your house, you're just not going to make it. So you're forced to hire people. And if you're hiring people out of pocket, your savings are gone. Your salary is gone. Your pension is gone. So we went to GoFundMe. And to tell you about the impact this woman made, we set a goal of $150,000. She met it in 10 days.
Wow.
If you read the messages of love that she got from former students, colleagues, friends, it was remarkable. But we should not be in a position where people have to beg for that kind of money, because there are people who would not have made that kind of an impact, who have just as much a right to live. And they're forced into a situation where they don't get that kind of help. Or if they do get the kind of help, it's going to be inferior. Something's wrong here. And so we had to live through it. And I'll tell you, we made another appeal, came October, and to try to raise the limit on the amount of money that we were going to bring in, because I knew that by January we were going to run out of money, even with the money we had raised. We're paying in excess of $16,000 a month for home health aides alone. Medical supplies that weren't covered. Just dietary needs, bed pads. You cannot even imagine the amount of money that you're putting out. You're running an in-home hospital. And not to mention the fact that, in terms of my own health too. So yes, I had help in the house, but as a caregiver, I am helping with medication because home health aides can't dispense medication. I am making sure that she's getting the proper food on time, ordering stuff for her, answering bells, answering phones, speaking to hospice agencies, health insurance agencies, doctors, nurses, social workers, also trying to get my own work done in the process. It took a lot out of me. It was absolutely exhausting mentally and physically. But something happened to her in November. We don't know what happened. It's as if the bottom fell out, and within 8 days, by November 22nd, she was gone. I'm sorry, November 26th of 2022, she was gone. She had barely made Thanksgiving. She was so sick, you couldn't even touch her. She was hurting everywhere. It was heartbreaking. The irony is that there was a wonderful gala to celebrate the centennial of Brooklyn Tech's opening. And at the gala, they presented her with a Lifetime Achievement Award. And she was not able to make that gala and she so wanted to. She was hoping to be the executive director, working straight through the centennial and beyond. And yet they were able to get a recording of that award presentation, and we put it up on the big screen for her. I've always thought in my heart that somehow, some way, it was a coda to her life. I almost feel as if she made her peace with everything, because it wasn't more than a week or so, a week and a half, 2 weeks later, that she was gone. It's a sad thing, but a necessary thing when you have to sit in the ending moments. I did the same thing with my mother, and say to your sister, you have provided for me your whole life. We have loved each other. I love you with all my heart. I always will. I know your love will be with me eternally, but you have to let go. You almost feel like they're holding on for you. And within 2 hours later, she was gone. But that's what caregiving is about. Sometimes you have to be able to say, let go. I miss my sister something fierce. We've lived together essentially 63 years. Nothing compares to this loss. You say, oh, people, you lose your mother, you lose everything. The difference is that I was 35, I lost my mother. My dad, I was 12. My Uncle Sam, I was 34. This woman I lived with my whole life. It was like a domestic partner, a best friend, our whole lives, So it's a loss that is, the grieving process is a very difficult one, but I'm a very, Nathaniel Brandon, who was a good friend of mine, wrote a book called The Disowned Self. And one thing I don't disown is my grief and my pain and the loss. I've also known, having gone through this process in the past, that eventually the good memories start to crowd out the difficult ones. It happened with my mom, and I know that in time it will happen here as well,
How is it now at home?
It's well, I'll tell you one thing I had to do, which was very hard. I had some friends of mine, relatives, saying, you don't have to do this now. You don't have to go through all of her belongings, My sister, God bless her, was a pack rat. We all suffer from that just a little bit. I'm not saying she was a hoarder, but there was a sense in which she never had a break in between jobs. She went from a teacher to an assistant principal to a principal, deputy superintendent, executive alumni foundation. She brought home the office from every one of these jobs and never got a chance to go through anything. So when she passed away, we're talking 50 plus years of her life I had to go through. And I didn't want to have to go through that in 6 months. I figured, look, the wounds are open. Let me bleed. It's like this, it's a cathartic process. And it was difficult. I mean, you don't realize the kinds of triggers that are happening. You could be fine 1 minute and then you open up a letter or a card or a photo, or a song comes on, or a commercial comes on, or a movie moment, whatever it is. and you're reduced to tears, And but if you saw this house 2+ months ago versus what it is now, you'd never believe it. I mean, it has been transformed back into an apartment from what it was as a hospital. I had to do it. We call it like feng shui, right? The issue of you have to be one with the environment. I needed to create a space for myself in order to feel at home with that environment, and mentally, your mental health is so important, and I could not do that certainly with the trappings of a hospital around me. So I will give the credit to the hospice because they were terrific in at least getting the hospital bed, the oxygen stuff, all the rigmarole of paraphernalia that you have out of the house within 2 days. It was gone. But everything else was left to me. And everything else was 2 years of stuff and 50 years of stuff that you have to also go through. So, it's been very hard. I count my blessings. I really do. I have had terrific support. I very much value the friendships and family relationships that I have. No man is an island. We all are in this social environment. And if we can't find the strength and love and support from one another, this is insane. Life would not be worth it. One thing I often point to, I even said this to my sister, it's about our effects on each other. There's a movie which is very famous called It's a Wonderful Life. It starred Jimmy Stewart, right? Oh, I know the Randians went crazy about it. It's a lot of, depictions of businessmen as evil. Nothing like that as far as I'm concerned. There's one particular very bad character who happens to be a banker who's not very, very good character. And, Jimmy Stewart apparently sacrifices a lot of his life to live in the town that he lives in and for his work. And, toward the end of the movie, a terrible tragedy happens and he wants to kill himself. And his guardian angel comes down and, essentially he says, I wish I'd never been born. And the guardian angel has a brilliant idea. He says, okay, you've never been born. You never existed. George Bailey, the character's name, you never were born. And so now they go back to the town, and the town is not what it was. It's completely changed. The human beings that he thought he knew don't know him. People whose lives he saved don't exist. Events that would have happened in the wake of his very existence have not happened. Other events have taken place. And I've often said there is not a movie I can think of that is a greater testament to the pebble being thrown on a still pond, watching the ripple effects of a single individual on the lives of countless people. And I said the same thing to my sister. I says, you raised the money you raised and got the love and support you got because you don't even know how many thousands, perhaps in fact millions, because she was responsible for changes even in the Department of Education's system, how many people whose lives you've affected. And look at the love and support that came back to you because of it. So we don't live in that kind of isolated world. And so I'm not, as I said, none of us is perfect, but damn it, do whatever you can, especially for the people you love. And it's one lesson that I have learned. And, maybe being a person with disabilities and having had my share of illnesses, I'm not saying, you have to be in my moccasins, so to speak. There's a little saying in there, it's an Indian prayer, which I read often. It says, I'll read it out loud. It says, grant that I may not criticize my neighbor until I've walked a mile in his moccasins, right? And it's very important. You have to walk in someone's moccasins. By the same token, if you've even had the pleasure of walking in your own and you've had the difficulties you've had, you learn the value of empathy. Yeah.
And do you still need help in your everyday life, or are you?
Well, financially, of course, I always need the help. One thing, fortunately, about my sister is that she has provided for me in death. I mean, I still got to do things on my own. I have essentially always been very self-sufficient, at least in terms of what I'm able to do in the house. I can cook for myself. I can go to a local store. Thank goodness there are ways of ordering things online. I mean, one thing that the pandemic did in terms of changing the parameters of what we do is we've learned to do a lot of things remotely. And that has, for someone who has limited mobility, that's also very, very good. You know, one thing too is that, you know, I can take an occasional trip. I just have to make sure that I take the trip and stay away for a good amount of time. And it involves me starving myself for a day or two to get someplace, fine. And then I'm there for a while and then starve myself to get back. Okay. But you know, you learn the ins and outs. You have to try to do that. And again, I've got friends and family who help me out, which is great. You know, we all help one another.
When I invited you to have this conversation, did you think about subjects that you wanted to bring up specifically?
Well, you know, we've touched on so much. Jeez, I feel I've been talking like I talked your ear off here. As you can see, I don't seem to lack for words, huh?
Well, you're a writer.
Well, yeah, that's what it is. You know, it's funny you say that because I got friends of mine who were on Facebook Messenger, okay, and you know, they'll make a statement and then I'll write an essay. It's like I got one friend of mine who says I was expecting a chapter, or you know, they'll wake up to 25 messages, each of which is in fact a chapter, and it's like, Jesus Christ, Daddy, what did you expect? I mean, all day on this. I got one friend in particular who write back, you know, like, you know, with hearts or, like, you know, emojis and, you know, answering every question, of course. He knocks out, you know, long messages from me, maybe in 10 minutes that took me, you know, it had gone on for like, you know, several hours worth of, you know, conversation back and forth. Good news is I'm a very fast typist. So you know, I get my thoughts right onto that messenger or on any piece of paper pretty quickly. So
you're lucky.
Yeah.
Would you have a final word?
I think one thing that's very important through all this is going to sound really hokey. I've really learned there are a lot of things in this world that people place value on, material things. I have ultimately felt that if you don't have love of self and love of those who mean so much to you, I'm not saying love is the answer to everything. Love doesn't pay the bills, but really it is so much of what life can give us. And I would like certainly to say that's where you start and that's where you can end. Keep the love alive.
Thank you, Chris.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much.
Before providing an update to this interview, I wanted to extend my deepest appreciation to Leah Hirschfeld for this opportunity to share my story. So much has happened since this interview was conducted on February 3rd, 2023. For one, I spent nearly 2 years downsizing so that I can move into a new apartment in October 2024. From January through September 2025, I underwent 17 procedures for hemorrhoidal bleeding caused by my dumping syndrome. I also had a bout of diverticulitis in July 2025, which was treated with antibiotics. In fact, that was my 5th bout with diverticulitis since 2016. Unfortunately, I had another bout in early October 2025. Unlike previous episodes, this time, my large intestine was perforated. I underwent emergency surgery on October 7th, in which my abdominal cavity was cleaned out, 4 inches of my sigmoid colon was removed, and a Hartmann's procedure was performed, giving me a colostomy. I had always been warned by doctors that a colostomy would be catastrophic for me, given my condition and all the adhesions from previous surgeries. But given a choice between a colostomy and dying, the colostomy didn't appear to be all that bad an option. Nevertheless, 3 days later, on October 10th, catastrophe hit. I developed severe pain and was rushed into another life-saving emergency surgery. My 1974 GI bypass had been severely compromised. The jejunum of the small intestine was torn and was leaking. I have to admit that as I was wheeled toward the OR, I made my peace with the very real possibility that I might die. I told my surgeon I was petrified, and he actually said the same thing to me, given the enormous complications we were dealing with. He asked me to give him very detailed information on my duodenojejunal bypass. I mean, the surgeons who performed that operation in 1974 were long gone, So I told him everything I knew and literally begged him to do the best he could. I emerged from surgery in the wee hours of October 11th, literally counting my blessings that I survived. I spent 7 weeks in the hospital and in a subacute rehab and lost nearly 30 pounds during that period. Since returning home on November 20th, 2025, I've gained back about 20 of those pounds. Now, a good 6 months since my surgeries, here we are. I face a choice between keeping the colostomy or undergoing reversal surgery at some point in the future, which carries enormous risks of complications due to my complex surgical history, since I've got so much scar tissue and adhesions. I'm also dealing with a newly diagnosed peristomal hernia. It's a relatively common occurrence for people living with surgically created stomas. In my case, loops of my small intestine have slipped through the incision of the weakened abdominal wall where the stoma was created. It's almost unavoidable given that I went through 2 enormously difficult emergency surgeries within 3 days of one another, which severely weakened that wall and of course, all my core muscles. I'm currently wearing an ostomy belt to contain the bulge. There's no obstruction. The colostomy is working perfectly, and I'm learning to live with it, so there are no plans to surgically repair the hernia. At this stage, the bottom line for me is this. Unless surgery is deemed medically necessary, I will not approve any elective surgical procedures moving forward. To say that I'm exhausted from all this is an understatement, but those surgeries in October, let's face it, they gave me a new lease on life, and for that I'm eternally grateful, especially for the love and support of family and friends. I've written 2 extensive essays about my life challenges. One was published on April 21st, 2024, on the 50th anniversary of the bypass surgery that saved my life from Superior Mesenteric Artery Syndrome. The other, on life with a colostomy, makes its debut with this podcast. So again, my very deepest appreciation to Leah for providing this wonderful forum that is so helpful to so many.
You've been listening to Out of Sync, exploring life through disability one story at a time. New episodes drop every Tuesday. Transcripts are available on YouTube and French language stories on Decali, Decales. I'm Leah Hirschfeld. Thanks for listening.